Thanks to Dollar Shave Club for sponsoring this video. Go to dollarshaveclub.com/geographics to get your starter set for just $5. On October 30th, 1961, the Soviet Union delivered perhaps the spookiest Halloween treat in history. 10 kilometers above the frozen, uninhabited island of Severny, a Tu-95 piloted by Andrei D dropped a single bomb. Weighing approximately 27 tons, the device fell for 1 minute before detonating 4,000 meters above Mityushikha Bay. What followed was the biggest man-made blast in history. The bomb exploded with a force 1,500 times greater than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. In a split second, a fireball 8 kilometers across winked into existence before transforming into a mushroom cloud that reached the edge of space. The flash was visible a staggering 1,000 kilometers distant. It said that the explosion was 10 times greater than that of every single munition deployed in World War II combined. But what possessed the Soviets to build the Tsar Bomba, and how did they come to choose obscure Severny as their proving grounds? Well, in this video, we're exploring the history of both Severny Island and the Tsar Bomba, the most powerful nuke in history. If you were to head northeast from Moscow across the frozen tundra and keep going for almost 2,000 kilometers, you'd eventually come to the Petroris Sea. Crossing this cold and icy sea, you'd land at last on a chain of 2 desolate islands, together stretching over 1,000 kilometers north. Known as Novaya Zemlya, these 2 islands are the textbook definition of inhospitable, lands of stark mountains, raging seas, and endless fields of ice. At the very northern end, the second island has temperatures that consistently hover around -16 degrees Celsius. Most days, its shores are lost in fog. On clear days, they're scoured by freezing winds. The name of this beautiful, miserable, godforsaken place is Severny. Today, it's famous for its wildlife, like Arctic foxes and polar bears. But in the middle of the last century, Severny was infamous for something else. It's here, some 6 decades ago, that Soviet scientists tested the Tsar Bomba, the biggest superweapon mankind has ever seen. But the history of Severny itself starts far earlier. First documented in the medieval times, Severny is so remote and uninviting that nobody even bothered to explore it until the 18th century. Even then, they didn't settle it. That's how inhospitable this island is. Even dudes who grew up in 1700s Siberia were like, you know what? That one's for the polar bears. In fact, Severny's remoteness was so great that no one could even say for certain that it belonged to Russia. In the 19th century, Norway began sending vessels sniffing around, trying to see if they couldn't swipe it. It was thanks to this that Severny got its first permanent population. In the 1870s, Moscow decided to deter Norway by colonizing the island. This being Imperial Russia, they didn't ask for volunteers, but instead rounded up a bunch of indigenous Nenets people, dumped them on Severny, and told them to just get on with it. And this is how Severny came to house a few hundred people surviving by hunting and fishing. But while those Nenets people would be able to survive Severny's harsh climate, their dislocated culture wouldn't survive the next great plan that Moscow had for them. Over the next few decades, the world away from the island changed beyond recognition. In Moscow, the Tsar was overthrown, only to eventually be replaced by a new kind of Tsar, a walrus-mustachioed leader who imprisoned and executed more than the Tsar could have ever dreamed of. Known as Josef Stalin, it was under his watch that the USSR was eventually dragged into World War II. And it was thanks to the endgame of this global war that Severny's fate was sealed. On July the 16th, 1945, at exactly 5:29 a.m., a bright red fireball appeared in the sky above the deserts of New Mexico. The Trinity test was the first ever detonation of a nuclear bomb, the moment American scientists cracked the atom's explosive secrets. Less than a month later, 2 of these superweapons were dropped onto Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The leveling of 2 Japanese cities was an awe-inspiring sight, awe-inspiring in the sense that it really did seem to evoke an enraged Old Testament God. Naturally, Tsar Walrus Chops wanted a piece of that action. Barely was World War II over than Stalin was tasking his sadistic right-hand man Lavrentiy Beria with building a bomb to rival Washington's new weapon. As work got underway, Beria visited the Lebedev Institute at the Soviet Academy of Sciences. There, he asked the nuclear physics team for volunteers. Of course, this being Beria asking for volunteers, it basically meant that you had to go, or you would be dragged into a freezing Moscow courtyard and shot in the head. So, when Beria suggested to physicist Igor Tamm that he'd join the new weapons program, well, you can bet your ass that Tamm said, "Da!" But Tamm didn't go alone. At the last moment, he asked his doctoral student, Andrei D. Sakharov, to accompany him. It would be this decision that led to Severny's apocalypse. Like many great scientists, Andrei Sakharov started his life in relative anonymity. Born in Moscow on May 21st, 1921, he was the son of a physics teacher who encouraged his interest in science. In fact, saying his dad encouraged him might be a bit of an understatement here. Sakharov's father delighted in nothing more than seeing his son run homemade experiments while other kids were outside playing. By 1938, this science-based childhood had eventually rubbed off. Sakharov enrolled at Moscow University to study physics. Not that he would physically be in Moscow when he graduated, though. In summer 1941, Nazi Germany came steamrolling into the Soviet Union, and Sakharov and his classmates were evacuated to modern-day Turkmenistan. It was in this empty outpost of the USSR that Sakharov got his degree. By then, it was already clear that he was destined for greatness, and he was exempted from military service. Come the end of the war, Sakharov returned to Moscow. There he got a placement under renowned physicist Igor Tamm at the Lebedev Institute. He was still there 2 years later when Beria came sniffing around for those volunteers. By now, it was Churchill had made his famous Iron Curtain speech, and the Truman Doctrine of containing communism was official US policy. That meant money was no object regarding Beria's offer. Sakharov and Tamm would have funding and prestige far beyond their wildest dreams. On the other hand, if they messed up, then it would be straight into one of those freezing Moscow courtyards and then straight into a shallow grave. Luckily, Sakharov was so skilled at nuclear physics that messing up simply wasn't an option. On August 29th, 1949, a mushroom cloud rose into the air above the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. It was the USSR's first successful nuclear detonation. With a yield of 22 kilotons, it was equal to anything in the American arsenal. Sakharov was there that day to witness the blast. It's likely he felt a surge of pride watching the fireball light up the sky. What Sakharov couldn't have known was that the Americans were about to go one better. In January 1950, President Harry Truman announced that his nation was working on a new kind of atomic bomb, which he called a hydrogen bomb or a super bomb. In Moscow, Beria was briefed on Truman's speech. Shortly after, another of his offers that you couldn't refuse landed on Sakharov and Tamm's desk. "Hey guys," it basically said, "loved your work on the A-bomb, but how about moving it up a few letters in the alphabet and getting started on the H-bomb, And make it fast, okay? Otherwise I might have to tell old Stalin that we need some new nuclear physicists, Within days, Sakharov had been sent to the Erasmus-16 nuclear facility some 450 kilometers from Moscow to try and crack the riddle of the hydrogen bomb. It was while there that Sakharov made his history-changing breakthrough. Sakharov designed what's been called a layered fission-fusion-fission device, essentially a nuclear bomb in which one layer's chain reaction would ignite another chain reaction in the layer above, and so on until you get the mother of all bangs. Sakharov named his breakthrough idea Sloika, or layer cake. Once it had been perfected, it would be capable of delivering a bomb so big it would dwarf anything the world had ever seen. The next couple of years would see the world engage in the biggest and most dangerous arms race in history. On October 3rd, 1952, Britain joined the nuclear club with a successful detonation in Australia, taking the number of atomic states to 3. Less than a month later, on November 1st, the US tested its first hydrogen bomb in the Marshall Islands. So far in this video, we've talked about yields in kilotons, with 15 kilotons being the size of the bomb that obliterated Hiroshima. Well, America's Ivy Mike test debuted at a staggering 10.5 megatons. Imagine the insane amount of damage that the Hiroshima bomb did. Now scale it up by roughly 700 times, and you have Ivy Mike. It was simply on another scale, an explosion beyond anything the Soviets could have ever dreamed of. At least, that's what the Americans believed. They didn't know that Andrei Sakharov was already dreaming even bigger than they were. In early 1953, Tamm returned to Moscow and Sakharov was made head of the entire Soviet H-bomb project. By now, the scientist was obsessed with cracking the thermonuclear problem. He didn't even need the motivation of Beria breathing down his neck. We know this because the death of Stalin in March and Beria's subsequent fall from grace and execution did not slow Sakharov's work in the slightest. Come summer, he was finally ready. On August 8, 1953, temporary Soviet Premier Georgy Malenkov announced to the world that the US no longer held a monopoly on hydrogen weapons. 4 days later, Sakharov showed them what that meant. The detonation of Joe 4, the disparaging American name the first Soviet hydrogen bomb was given, caused an explosion equivalent to 400,000 tons of TNT. Although this was a mere fraction of what Ivy Mike had achieved, barely a rounding error in American terms, it was still the biggest bomb the Soviets had tested yet. After the mushroom cloud had faded, Sakharov was rewarded with the title Hero of Socialist Labor, the highest civilian award in the USSR. But while the motherland had been impressed with his achievements, the Americans were still light years ahead. In March 1954, the Castle Bravo test blew over Bikini Atoll. A 15-megaton monster, it vaporized 3 whole islands, turned the sky to fire, and made observers a whole 50 kilometers away feel like someone was applying a blowtorch to their faces. It was the biggest bomb Washington would ever detonate. For the Soviets, it was now imperative that they also break the megaton limit. They finally made it a year later. In November 1955, Sakharov traveled to the Semipalatinsk test site to observe the USSR's biggest nuke yet. Flying over the frozen Kazakh steppe, the scientist pondered the view below. The way the dark turbulent waters of the Irtysh, dotted with 1,000 whirlpools, bore the milky blue ice floes northward, twisting them and crashing them together. Nature was displaying its might, he said later. Compared to it, all man's handiwork seems paltry imitation. But there would be nothing paltry about Sakharov's latest slice of layer cake. On November the 22nd, a 1.5 megaton device was dropped from a plane over Semipalatinsk. When it exploded, a blinding flash bleached the landscape, followed by a shockwave that knocked people off their feet. But while Sakharov's initial feeling on seeing the detonation was one of great achievement, it soon curdled into something much more sour. The force of the bomb had collapsed small buildings across the region. A trench had fallen down on soldiers watching the blast. A crude bomb shelter had collapsed on villagers living nearby, and a hospital roof had caved in on a ward full of patients. The end result was 47 people with serious injuries and 2 dead, a young soldier and a 2-year-old Kazakh girl. It was Sakharov's first encounter with the consequences of such awesome weapons. As he later wrote, "I experienced a fear that this newly released force could slip out of control and lead to unimaginable disasters. The accident reports, and especially the deaths of the little girl and the soldier, heightened my sense of foreboding. I could not escape a feeling of complicity." But there was no time for the scientist to start questioning his commitment to the Soviet nuclear program now. That same year, the Nanets people of Severny Island were all evacuated onto the Russian mainland. Moscow had just chosen the site of its new proving ground. And if I was being evacuated anywhere, I would immediately grab my razor from Dollar Shave Club, because you gotta stay sharp. And I want to tell you a bit about them before we continue with today's video. Dollar Shave Club cover all of your grooming needs: shower, oral care, deodorants, and most importantly, shaving. Now, obviously, I don't shave my beard, but I do shave my head, and that experience has become a whole lot better since I switched to Dollar Shave Club and started using their high-quality blades. Dollar Shave Club sent me their ultimate starter set, which, of course, razor and the blades. I've got a little table down here. I say it's a table, it's actually a chair. I've got their razor, I've got the extra blades. Also, these three things that come with it. There's the prep scrub. Obviously, you put that on ahead of time. There's the shave butter, which you whip on, and then you shave, and I use all of this on my head, remember? And then afterwards, there's the post-shave dew. I rather like the post-shave dew because my head gets a little bit dry sometimes after a shave. Honestly, my head just gets a little bit dry anyway, and this really helps out with that. So visit dollarshaveclub.com/geographics. You'll get this ultimate shave starter set for only $5, and why not round out your grooming routine by adding any other of their high-quality products? After that, the restock box ships at the regular price, and let's get back to today's video. After Castle Bravo, America had a change of heart. Out went building bigger and bigger nukes, and in came in building smaller bombs that could be placed on highly accurate missiles. But the Soviets hadn't had their Castle Bravo yet. The dream was still to build a bomb bigger than anything the Americans could hope to match. The dream finally came true in July of 1961. Seen through a narrow lens, this might seem like a strange time for the Tsar Bomba to be built. Since 1958, the USA, the USSR, and UK had been observing an unofficial moratorium on nuclear testing, albeit one that had been interrupted by the French detonating their first atomic bomb in 1960. But when you look at the wider picture, it suddenly starts to make a lot more sense. In mid-1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion had just happened. The US was busy installing nuclear missiles in Turkey, just over the USSR's border. In a handful of weeks, the Berlin Wall would go up. In short, it was a tense time, one during which Moscow was feeling hemmed in and threatened. Which may be why Khrushchev summoned Sakharov on July 10th, 1961. At the meeting, he ordered the scientists to start work on the biggest bomb he'd ever built, something that would make Castle Bravo look like a wet fart. There was just one catch. The bomb would have to be ready to test by the end of the 22nd Party Congress. That meant Sakharov had just 16 weeks to design and build a superweapon that would make God himself tremble. If he didn't, well, these were the Khrushchev years. No one got shot in courtyards anymore. But they did lose their jobs. They did get publicly disgraced and driven from their homes. It may have been lenient compared to anything Beria might have done, but it was still enough to make sure Sakharov worked his arse off. The pressure on the scientist must have been immense, but it worked. Before long, Sakharov unveiled the scariest blueprint in history. The big bomb would be another classic slice of layer cake, this time with 3 layers that would seriously interact with one another. When Sakharov's team ran the figures, they calculated their bomb would have a yield of not 1 megaton, not 10 megatons, but 100 megatons. Okay, so some perspective. Remember that Castle Bravo test that vaporized 3 islands? Well, that was 15 megatons, about 1,000 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb. Sakharov's big bomb would be 3,000 times the size of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. It would dwarf Castle Bravo, a bomb that had burned flesh 50 kilometers from ground zero. In fact, it would be so big that Sakharov worried it might be too big. With an explosion in the 100 megaton range, no one knew what would happen. Sakharov became haunted by visions of the whole of northern Russia being swamped with radiation. At the last minute, with the test day fast approaching, the scientist balked. He had the uranium layers in his Sloika replaced with lead, effectively halving the bomb's yield. It's this smaller version that would become known as the Tsar Bomba that would be soon dropped on Severny. But smaller here's a relative concept. When Sakharov's Tsar Bomba blew, it would still be with enough force to shake the entire world. On the morning of October 30th, 1961, a heavy plane took off from Russia's Kola Peninsula near the border regions with Finland. The Tu-95 bomber was piloted by veteran flyer Andrei D, but it was unlike any bomber he had flown before. For one, its bomb bay doors had been removed and the plane's outside painted a bright reflective white. For another, strapped to the underside was the biggest bomb the world had ever seen. The Finnish Tsar Bomba was an incredible 8 meters long and weighed more than 27 tons. It had a giant parachute attached to it, weighing an additional ton. The plan was that this would slow the bomb's fall, giving Donostsev time to speed away from the blast. Even so, the flight crew's chance of survival had been calculated as no better than 50%. The 1,000-kilometer flight took the plane over frigid waters. At long last, a strip of barren, frozen land appeared on the horizon. It was the island of Severny, the Tsar Bomber's final target. At slightly past 11:30 a.m. Moscow time, Major Donovtsev piloted his Tu-95 over Mityushikha Bay. At the height of 10 kilometers, he pressed the release button. Below, the massive Tsar Bomba dropped, falling silently as Donovtsev sped away. The device fell for almost 1 minute, an angel of death serenely tumbling toward the ground. At 11:32, at precisely 3,940 meters above the island, it detonated. The Tsar Bomber explosion was like nothing the world had ever seen. In the barest fraction of a second, a fireball 8 kilometers wide appeared in the sky over Severny. The flash that accompanied it was so bright it could be seen from over 1,000 kilometers away. In an instant, a mushroom cloud 64 kilometers high had formed, 7 times taller than Mount Everest. Its top stretched 100 kilometers from end to end. Within split seconds, the blast was radiating outwards, traveling at incomprehensible speeds across Russia. 55 kilometers away from the hypocenter, the abandoned Nenets village of Severny, named after the island it was built on, was completely obliterated. 100 kilometers away, all animals out in the open had their flesh ignite, searing them with third-degree burns. 160 kilometers away, about the distance from New York City to Philadelphia, wooden buildings were knocked flat, while brick buildings had their roofs swept away. About 250 kilometers away, any living thing that looked directly into the blast suffered serious eye damage. By 700 kilometers away, now about the distance from Manhattan to Quebec City, window panes shattered, spraying people with glass. The shockwave of the Tsar Bomba was ultimately felt all the way to Finland. In the air close to ground zero, Andrei Donovtsev's plane was almost knocked out of the sky, plummeting 1,000 meters before he managed to regain control. One of the observers on board would later write, "At that moment, our aircraft emerged from between 2 cloud layers, and down below in the gap, a huge bright orange bull was emerging. The bull was powerful and arrogant like Jupiter. Slowly and silently it crept upwards. Having broken through the thick layer of clouds, it kept growing. It seemed to suck the whole of the earth into it. The spectacle was fantastic, unreal, supernatural." The blast wave of the Tsar Bomba circled the Earth 3 times. Despite blowing 4 kilometers in the air, it set off seismographs across Russia, registering as a 5-scale quake. It was simply one of the biggest bangs in history. When Mount St Helens erupted in 1980, it was roughly half the size of the Tsar Bomber. The detonation knocked out all radio communication over northern Russia for the best part of an hour. By the time it was re-established, the entire world was aware of what had happened. The Soviets had just detonated the biggest nuke in history, and now the world was determined to make sure that it never happened again. One of the interesting things about the Tsar Bomba is that despite its raw power, it was effectively useless. Such a destructive bomb was far too big to be loaded onto a missile. Any bomber it was attached to would be moving so slowly that it wouldn't even make it to Western Europe, let alone America, before being shot down. It was a propaganda event, pure and simple. A way for Khrushchev to allow himself a sly little smile anytime the Americans mentioned Castle Bravo. But in the 1960s, no one saw it this way. The outrage the Tsar Bomber generated was probably almost as explosive as the Tsar Bomber itself. The test was too powerful. At this size, scientists were messing with forces so far beyond their control that a single slip might irradiate an entire hemisphere. Along with lingering memories of Castle Bravo, it was outrage at the Tsar Bomber that helped push through the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty in 1963, driving nuclear weapons tests underground. Even then, no one would ever test anything of comparable size again. Interestingly, one of those driven to action in the wake of the Severny test was Andrei Sakharov. Faced with the awesome power of the bomb and knowing it could have been twice as big, the nuclear physicist had his Oppenheimer moment. But while Oppenheimer merely felt in his soul the awful godlike power of his work, Sakharov became determined to do something about it. Starting in 1963, he began to agitate for a full-on ban on nuclear weapons. Eventually, he got so vocal that he was removed from his position. When that didn't work, the USSR relocated him to a remote, miserable town in the middle of nowhere and hounded him day and night. Sakharov was only allowed to finally return to Moscow in the mid-1980s as part of Gorbachev's thaw. He died on December 14th, 1989. His goal of a world without nuclear weapons, still just a distant dream. And so what about Severny itself? Is it now a radioactive wasteland, a Chernobyl of the frozen north? Well, no, not at all. Despite being really, really big, the Tsar Bomba was one of the cleanest ever detonations, leaving very little radioactive material behind. Yes, Severny remains uninhabited. The Nenets people never returned to their destroyed village. The only signs of life today are a Russian military base and a weather station. Oh, and the occasional tourists who come to hike in the beautiful remote wastes of Severny's National Park. But while the physical evidence of the Tsar Bomba may be gone, its memories still linger. Although it would seem unbelievable to someone standing on Severny now, it was here, at this very place, that mankind came closest to building a superweapon to rival God. In a single flash of light, he showed once and for all our abilities to annihilate ourselves, to end all life, with just the push of a button. It's a terrifying power, and the worst part is we still have it. It's estimated that there are still roughly 14,000 nukes in existence around the world today. None of them may be capable of a 50-megaton blast, but they are all still incredibly destructive. It's chilling to think that the era of nuclear explosions may not be over, that in 10, 50, or even 100 years, our descendants may be looking back on a bomb so big it could make even the Tsar Bomba seem small. The story in today's video may be finished, but the story of humanity's weapons of mass destruction will never likely end. All we can do is repeat the prayer that Andrei Sakharov once offered after seeing his first H-bomb test. May all of our devices explode as successfully as today's, but always over test sites and never over cities. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do smash that thumbs up button below and do not forget to subscribe, and also support this channel by supporting one of our fantastic sponsors, Blinkist, who I'm linking to below. And thank you for watching.